Unmute. All right, so we'll be getting started now. We just make sure that the stream can hear us and see us okay. And maybe be quiet. That was meant to be targeted, but no, you're good. Is the stream look good, David? Okay, wonderful. So today we'll be talking about strategy, specifically micro and macro strategy in the context of Battlecode. Similar to my pathfinding lecture last week, it's going to be more of a high level. It's going to give you sort of what questions should you be asking rather than telling you what to do, because, well, there's many strategies you could implement. So if there was only one strategy, if there was one best strategy, then there'd be no point in this competition. And so our goal is to just give you a high-level overview of what questions you should be thinking about as you are continuing to develop your robots. Anything to say? No. All right. So there you go. So just to get us on the same page, just in case you aren't quite sure what we mean, when we talk about microstrategy, we're talking about like short-term individual behavior. So this is deciding what every individual baby rat, for example, should be doing. Should they be going for cheese? Should they be attacking enemy rats? Should they be attacking cats? It's very, very focused, and it's their behavior when you're coding it in isn't very well, it's related, but it isn't immediately related to your macro strategy, which is your sort of broader goal and what you're trying to do. So macro strategy is referring to like how you're behaving throughout the entire game. Are you being very aggressive? Are you attacking the enemy team? Are you trying to attack the cat? Are you being passive? Are you just saving up cheese? And it's a lot more about managing your overall economy, how much dirt you have, how much cheese you have. And yeah. Next slide.
So first off, we'll be starting with MicroStrategy, and then we'll move on to MacroStrategy afterwards. So the first thing I want to talk about is pathfinding. So this is regarding individual baby rats. The questions that you'll be wanting to ask is basically, how do you want to pathfind the best? Obviously, there's some very simple pathfinding strategies that involve very simple code, but in order to win, you obviously want to do a lot more than just that. You'll want to, choose if you want to like remember where you've been to see if you want to see where your teammates have been, where your allied rats have been. You want to see if you want to like break down dirt or like specific, or you want to go after rat kings or rats, or you want to search for cats, or you want to search for achieve mines. So there's lots of questions on pathfinding, and this is going to be like specifically each individual rat. There is like a lot of things you can do on the macro scale for pathfinding, but for just for micro, it's very hard to implement a very good pathfinding, and this should be one of your main priorities if you want to get a good robot. Because if you get stuck trying to pathfind, you just get if you get stuck not being able to find cheese, as we saw in a lot of the sprints, or if you aren't able to go through diagonals, then your rat is cooked basically.
Right. So just to bring in an example, if you on the stream or in person, if you watched Sprint 1, there was a team. I regret not looking through and actually finding the names of the team, but also maybe I shouldn't call them out. But there were some teams that in their pathfinding algorithms, they didn't implement any way of getting through dirt. So depending on the map, if you are completely surrounded by dirt, you just can't go anywhere because you didn't build that in. So these questions, while we talked about pathfinding algorithms in general previously, what exactly you put into those algorithms is up to you, and it's something you really should be careful about and thinking what you put in there. So next we're going to talk about biting or rat combat in general, because there's also rat throwing, which I guess I didn't write on here. The first thing you really should be asking yourself is, am I going to try to cooperate or are we going to backstab? That informs you about how quickly am I going to just go ahead and try to attack the enemy team, or are we going to focus forces on a cat? There's also managing individual rat cooldowns. So a cat or a baby rat can't constantly keep attacking. So there's that question of how do you be strategic? Again, that's a question you end up having to answer for yourselves. And there's also this question about baby rats and their cheese. So one of the functions you might have noticed is that baby rats can essentially strengthen themselves by consuming cheese. But the whole point of collecting cheese in the first place is bringing it back to your rat king so the rat king doesn't starve. So you have this balance of I see an enemy rat. Do I consume all of our cheese so that we can defeat this enemy rat, but then have no cheese to bring back to the rat king? Or do I take a gamble, eat, say, like half of our cheese, hope we defeat the enemy rat and bring the remaining to the rat king? So these are all kind of questions that you should be thinking about as you're, developing your rat combat.
One thing I saw during the sprints is that basically every single team chose to not cooperate. And so it'd be really interesting to see if they're actually like try to figure out what the benefits of cooperating are and how you can use that to your advantage right now, because every team is trying to backstab. So maybe you could work that to your advantage. So another micro thing I want to talk about is the rat traps. As you know, there is only 25 rat traps that can be placed per team. And so you should really be trying to manage this. During some of the sprints, we saw just multiple teams just spamming down rat traps, which is really good, but after you spam them down, you don't have any more rat traps to place down. And so there was many situations during the sprints that I saw in which they could have used the rat traps, but they were at their limit. And so one really important micro is not just to figure out when to place our rat traps, but also to conserve your rat traps.
And also talking about rat traps, I'm actually going to connect this into our next slide, cat traps, is that rat traps and cat traps cannot be placed on top of each other. So you have a choice of, we saw this a lot in sprints. Do you either choose to, or maybe neither, but do you choose to protect your rat king with rat traps to defend against the enemy team? Or do you choose to defend it against, or use cat traps to defend it against the cat and try to focus your attacks on the enemy team? Similar to rat traps, the cat traps have a limited number, so only 10, yes, 10 per team. So you have to be very strategic on where you're putting them. If you have, especially on those really large maps, those 60 by 60 maps, 10 cat traps are not going to be effective if you're just placing them randomly. So your placement is very important. And also choosing, whether you're going to focus on using those rat traps or your cat traps if you choose to play defensively like that. Oh, and also that cat traps cannot be placed after backstab. So if you're trying to go for a more cooperative strategy, just being aware that maybe placing them earlier on before you can't place them anymore.
Yeah, I remember seeing that one team where they just placed at the very start, they placed like 9 cat traps around their rat king. That was an interesting strategy. So that one team that did place down those 9 cat traps right around the rat king did move immediately afterwards. So not sure what the plan was there, but rat king movement is pretty important. Another example that I remember seeing that stood out was this one team. It was on a really large map, and the right team, they moved their rat king all the way around the map. And so it's a risky move, but it also worked out for them in their favor because they were able to access more cheese more easily. And so that is one way to get advantage with rat king movement. There's lots of other ways.
And another thing we saw in sprint one was rat kings that didn't move at all. And this was really bad because what happened is, let's say you had all of your baby rats attack the enemy team and they all died. If your rat king's not moving, it's not collecting any cheese. So it doesn't have any cheese to make more baby rats, and it's also going to die of starvation. And we saw this with one of the teams that it had cheese literally right next to it, but the team just didn't implement any behavior for the rat king, so it just ended up dying, even though there was cheese right there. So being careful of that sort of thing is really important. And I would recommend, if you haven't, taking a deep dive into the API, because there are a lot of things that the rat king can do that the rats also do. It can attack, it can pick up cheese, it can move just slower with bigger cooldowns, but it can do a lot of those things.
All right, so now we're going to move on to the broader scale of the macro strategy. So one thing that is really good from macro is rat role separation. Basically, choosing different rats to do different things. We coded this in one of our previous lectures where we chose some of the rats to go after cheese mine specifically and had other rats go explore. There are, obviously complications of this as trying to figure out how many of these rats you want exploring versus how many you want collecting cheese. For example, during our lecture, we couldn't get any of the rats to go look for cheese, and they were all exploring basically. And so it's going to be, you have to dynamically change the ratio based on like how big the map is, which is a little difficult.
There also, while the multiple roles sort of approach can be more flexible, there also is a question about debugging because when you're watching it in the client, you might not immediately be able to tell which rat is which, especially if they're doing kind of similar things. So you just have to be more careful about adding print statements or like really reading those game logs to make sure the rat you said was picking up cheese is actually picking up cheese and not doing something else because there's a bug in your code. Next, we'll just talk about managing resources. There's not much that like we can really specifically say here. We're just looking at, be mindful of how much cheese you have. The client team has been listening. They've implemented some like something in the client so that you can know how much cheese you have, for example. And I believe dirt has always been there. You know how much dirt is on the map. And so really the question is, once you have a set amount of dirt, what do you do with it? Especially at the beginning, in the middle, at the end. So in sprint one, we see a lot of teams, they have their set amount of cheese, they just make as many baby rats as possible, and they just go for it. Other teams that might be more conservative, might save their cheese so they don't, they have cheese to maintain their hunger. Dirt is also a sort of resource in this game because it's conserved. So you can only build dirt after you broke down another piece of dirt. So if you are trying to create, let's say, a blockade against the enemy rat or maybe the cat, you do have to be mindful that that dirt has to come from somewhere else. So it's really just about, being careful about where you're taking it from.
During the sprint, I saw multiple teams in which they had rats that had cheese, but their rat king was still dying a lot. This happened to a lot of teams. So make sure you manage your resources, manage your cheese, bring that to your rat king. All right, so communication is our next topic. We had previous lecture on communication. If you didn't go there, make sure you watch that. But obviously, the overall aspect is trying to figure out what to communicate. And because you only have a limited array, you want to be mindful of how you're using your array to communicate. There's lots of things you can do to make the most of your array, as we talked about in our last lecture. As for the sprints, I didn't really like there was like some examples of communication, for example, where the rushing strategy where they found the rat kings and they all rushed, that was extremely successful. But if the map is really large, I saw a team in which they try to communicate to bring all the rats over to the other side, but all their baby rats died and that cooked them. So make sure you communicate well.
I don't have anything more to say about this. So we're going to go back to cooperation backstab, which I kind of talked about. As has been mentioned, has also been discussed quite extensively in the Discord. It appears that teams seem to prefer backstabbing. And maybe it's not just a preference, maybe it's because you can't go back to cooperations after a backstab. But it is important to, when you're writing your code, to really ask yourself, am I choosing a strategy or am I letting a strategy, one of the stages happen? If we are in cooperation, cooperation just happens, backstab, it just happened. Choosing one or the other doesn't need to be, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. What I'm going to say is, since we'll focus on backstab, since it tends to be more popular, there's really two sort of strategies you might go towards. You might try to rush your opponent, which means make as many baby rats as possible and just go from there, try to kill off their rat king. Or you might try to play a little bit more defensively. Even though in backstab, the cat's damage is less relevant, it's still 30% of the score. So in the case of a tie, which we'll talk more about later, it's still worthwhile to, even in backstab, go for the cat. So it ends up being a balance of how much do you want to just try to go for the enemy team and try to end the game quicker versus trying to, just stay in the game, keep the game going, and wait until the end game where you see how much cheese you have, see how many rat kings you have.
All right, and the final thing we'll be talking about is tie breaking. There are a few teams that we saw in which it actually went to around 2000, and most of the teams, the good teams, well, they chose to make Rat Kings around 1900, and that obviously that basically won them the game. They might have still won without it, but they definitely gave them the edge. So make sure you understand how the tie breaking formulas are in play for both cooperation and backstab mode, but probably backstabs since everyone's backstabs. And try to use that to your advantage.
Another thing that can be, besides the creating as many rat kings as possible, Another thing to note is that the amount of points you earn is determined by the amount of cheese transferred. So let's say you're, at the end game, there's only, let's say, 100 rounds left. It might be worthwhile to send a signal to your baby rat and say, hey, come back, just bring all the cheese that you have instead of staying out and about, because whatever cheese that the rats have that's just mingling around, those don't count to your points. You need them to bring them back to your rat kit. Yes.
If rats carrying the cheese form a rat king, does that count as transferring cheese?
I actually don't know the answer
I'm not
to
sure.
that question.
We will
We will
back
look
to you.
into this.
Get back to you. Good question.
Very good question. So, but point is just to be mindful of what these criteria are if you do end up coming to the end of the game at round 2000, and try and figure out how to maximize your chances of winning at that stage. I believe, yes, I believe that is all that we had. These were very, high level things. Again, our goal is not to give you specific strategies to use because there's no one best one to use. These are just questions you really should be thinking about as you're making the bot. There are also probably many other aspects that we didn't consider that we didn't explicitly talk about. Do not treat this as like, a master list of things considered, then, oh, we implemented this, we're done. Really think hard, think game theoretically, think like programmers.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We'll move on to office hours. Thank you to everyone in the stream.